Hey, I'm Julian Sanchez, and this is your WatchCats daily news roundup for Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. And joining me for the first time today, our man of many turns who has traveled far and wide, Noah Coonan.
I'm not dead.
Welcome back from your voyages, Noah. First up this Wednesday, a kind of cluster of privacy-related stories. Some of them more DOGE adjacent than DOGE centered, but I think we'll try and connect the dots for you and show why it makes sense to talk about them together. First up, the Internal Revenue Service has struck an agreement with the Department of Homeland Security to share migrants' tax information with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. The I.R.S. data is traditionally very carefully siloed from other agencies, but an agreement has been struck between the agencies to essentially make use of a legal carve-out, allowing the sharing of that data in connection with criminal investigations, at least to start in the cases of migrants who have remained in the country despite having received a court order to leave. Now, this is a big deal and is upsetting a lot of people within the I.R.S. because precisely because they want to encourage people to file accurate tax information, they want to preserve the I.R.S.'s reputation as a place where your private data, often very sensitive financial information, is not going to be used for purposes other than evaluating your tax liabilities. It's not going to be shared with other agencies that may have other aims and use that information against you in various ways. Even undocumented migrants in the U.S. pay a lot of taxes, tens of billions of dollars every year. And so the prospect of that tax data being used for immigration enforcement is likely, in the view of a lot of experts, to deter tax compliance by those folks. In a way, this is kind of a benefit for the United States, because there are people who are paying into systems like Social Security who are probably never going to end up receiving those benefits. The Yale Budget Lab estimated that over 10 years, this could cost about $313 billion in lost tax revenue. And this was sufficiently disturbing to people within the I.R.S. that, in fact, the acting commissioner of the I.R.S., Melanie Krause, is actually resigning over this information sharing deal. This follows shortly on the heels of the former chief counsel at the I.R.S. being pushed out and replaced by a Elon Musk pro-Doge ally named Andrew DeMello. So there's the link there. This is formally a deal between DHS and I.R.S., but this is part and parcel of a program of information consolidation that DOGE has been spearheading and is in tune with a executive order urging greater data consolidation that Donald Trump signed in late March. So stepping back from those specific stories to take a broader look, I want to highlight for folks a story that appeared this week in Rolling Stone called "Trump and DOGE Are Trying to Get Around Privacy Laws to Gather Your Personal Info." So that's, again, a more sort of synoptic look at the multi-pronged attempts DOGE staff have been making to consolidate information and access different agency databases. I think that's worth a read if you want that kind of 30,000-foot view. One of the things they note is that the Trump administration seems to have found a kind of workaround for the limitations embedded in the Privacy Act, which is essentially mandates a degree of siloing and limits sharing between agencies by technically classifying DOGE employees as employees of the agencies where their little sort of mini DOGE subgroup is installed. So you have someone, from DOGE at I.R.S., at DHS, at the Department of Education, at, name your agency. And so when that person accesses those data systems, it is technically not, at that stage at least, being shared outside of that agency. Technically, they're an employee. Problem, of course, is that these are all people who are, effectively still DOGE people. They're all working in one consolidated team. And so it's unclear to me how meaningful that kind of paper separation is going to be. And frankly, it also makes it pretty hard to police hey, what are these little sub teams within the agencies actually sharing with each other?
And this was always apparent from the first executive order on, right? That
Yeah.
dictated the creation of these agency-specific DOGE teams. And I do wonder if, after all of this, presuming there's an after all of this, there will be some counteraction from Congress limiting the ability to work at multiple federal agencies in positions of leadership or any other position for that matter for any length of time. This was never seen to be an issue because people had real jobs, real full-time jobs, real responsibilities that they had to do. And DOGE has very much found a glitch in the matrix to abuse in this regard.
Yep. I mean, this is one reason, maybe it was that DOGE ended up being housed at the U.S. Digital Service, because as we've, as you knew already, and as I've learned in talking to some of the USDS alumni we've interviewed on the podcast, right, those folks are typically sort of seconded out to other agencies. And so you end up with a USDS team within Veterans Affairs or Health and Human Services. And so it was kind of, that structure was already there.
Yeah, and then this is the difference between being rehired somewhere and double dipping versus detailing, right? So if you haven't already carved out the non-political bureaucrats that work in an agency and you're detailing somebody from USDS or 18F or any other place to them, they can get kicked out pretty quickly, right? So if the long-standing civil servants at Agency X, gotta stop using the X as a symbol, at Agency Y, let's just say in this case, the IRS is like, whoa, they are not following your procedures, right? They're not up to muster. They can just kick them out at will because they're not actually working there. They're a detailee from GSA, from OMB, from wherever, right?
And of course, what
so
we're
there's
seeing
a really
here
quick accountability action there.
What we're seeing here is sort of the opposite, right? Is
exactly
the acting head of the IRS and the head lawyer at the IRS both essentially either resigning or being demoted when they clash with the DOGE people. The last sort of privacy-related story I want to highlight for folks, this is actually when I spoke to the reporter about, Emily Badger in the New York Times has a piece titled What the Government Knows About You in Official Data Sets Trump Wants to Link Together. And this is the most comprehensive list I've seen of all the different kinds of data about individuals that DOGE is seeking access to. And so it found more than 300 separate fields of data contained in 23 different data systems across 8 different agencies. And I think one of the things that is highlighted here is how many different bits of information the government has about you. And I think maybe a thing people don't think about as much as folks who work on privacy full time. I was a privacy wonk at a think tank for a dozen years. Is individually sort of innocuous information can become much more revealing when it is linked together. So if you go to CVS and you buy a pack of condoms, and then you go to a restaurant and you have dinner with your date, and you pay for your for your meal, and then your cell phone is kind of tracking your location the whole time, and then you go to a hotel. Those are a bunch of data points that individually don't tell much of a story. If you link them together, they do tell a story. And in particular, thinking about what's in these different data sets, one of the things that's included is, for example, charitable contributions. This is one of the things the IRS might know about you. Looking at your charitable contributions might give a pretty clear sense of whether you're someone who's a big supporter of liberal causes or anti-Trump causes or pro-immigration reform causes. And that's information that, if you imagine it now being put in the hands of law enforcement, put in the hands of even just other agencies that are doing hiring. We have reports about DOGE going around and asking people at agencies, what are your political views? How do you feel about Elon Musk? How do you feel about Donald Trump? We can imagine this kind of being used to recreate a sort of patronage system where people with the wrong political views or people who have supported the wrong political causes find themselves locked out of access to government employment or other benefits. In any event, it's a long article. I don't want to go through every different kind of data that they talked about, but Emily Badger at the New York Times has, again, the most comprehensive list I've seen of the different kinds of data that DOGE is trying to access and why that might be a concern for people.
Yeah, we are decades in to being late to reforming the various privacy acts and statutes of the United States to accommodate the fact that we live in a digital world. This is a huge part of how DOGE is transforming the federal government, and a tremendous story that we're going to be digging into more deeply as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think probably sometime in the next week or two, we will have a more comprehensive, full podcast episode looking at DOGE and the privacy implications of the kind of consolidation they're trying to do.
Jumping from privacy to everyone's favorite topic, HR, and several blocks away from the White House, to the Supreme Court, which is the Supreme Court has issued a unsigned letter saying that they are not going to stop the firing of probationary employees while not ruling on whether or not the decision was legal. Again, this is a massive case with lots of different entities arguing that they have standing to sue. Part of that decision was knocking out one of the legs of the case. There was a group, a network of nonprofits who, along with unions, were suing the administration. The Supreme Court has ruled in a majority decision that they currently haven't shown the evidence enough for standing, so they're off the case. But the unions and their arguments, they're still on. So the lower courts are going to adjudicate this, but in the short term, those probationary employees will, in fact, be separated from government service. This is an insane and absurd amount of whiplash from them, but not exactly unexpected. This is exactly what I thought would be decided. The older I get, the more I sort of realize that standing is whatever anyone says it is. It is not real or quantitative or qualitative in any way. It is entirely based on the personal predilections of the judges in any particular case.
Although
but
we should note this time, this is not the usual kind of conservatives versus liberals breakdown, or
correct.
Most of the conservatives and one of them joining the liberals breakdown. This one's 7-2, and the liberals sort of dissenting were kind of just weren't necessarily saying no, they do have standing. They were saying I wouldn't have ruled on the question at this stage. So I mean, this may be an issue where, to the extent standing is real, where some of these groups have a sort of tenuous link to the concrete injury that you're supposed to need to be able to bring suits in part, because everything is happening so quickly that a lot of these kind of pre-existing groups were the ones with sort of the capability to get up and running fast enough to file suit.
And, from a personal opinion, I don't know how I would have necessarily would if I was a judge on the nonprofit standing. And it's certainly good legal strategy because you don't want to paint yourself out of an argument, especially when the stakes are this high, right? It is perfectly reasonable for these nonprofits to have made a maximal argument as early as possible. So as more evidence and harm develops, they can say, hey, we have never not acted with the assumption that this was our standing to sue. So that they're taking a maximal strategy there, and that's perfectly reasonable and within their rights to do so. The Supreme Court did not rule as to the standing of the unions, because I think that's kind of pretty apparent on its face. What it does mean is we are already seeing examples of teams in government doing net new hires, not even DOGE-related hires, to the positions that they fired, right? Mm-hmm. And so even if these people get summoned back into government, how many of those people will return? How many of these people will already have jobs? How many of those people will find another human being already at their desk, right? So do not assume, not that I think anyone who listens to this show is going to assume, that that Humpty Dumpty can simply be put back together again in 6 months, in 9 months, whenever a lower court or going up to the Supreme Court on appeal decides on this. It is going to be chaos for the foreseeable future. Speaking of DOGE staffers, though, we also saw a story indicating that 3 DOGE staffers were given unlimited 24/7 access at NASA, including 2 locations like the administrator's suite. This is notable because of several letters from Congress indicating that they reviewed information indicating that these individuals, while potentially have completed at least the standard background check, which I will tell you is pretty easy to pass. It is not an extensive check. In government, you are usually given probationary access, so they do a standard background check. That's usually 1 to 3 weeks, and that looks like something you would expect at a company, even a mid-sized company, much less a Fortune 500 company. There's then an additional check, which can take up to a year, right? And if you don't pass it, right, in your probationary period, the government can separate employment with you relatively quickly, right? These individuals, it looks like NASA has an additional sort of intermediate layer, a confidence check designation after the standard background check. And the ratings of these DOGE individuals are not commensurate with that of senior executive staff for IT or finance or anything else for that matter, but rather at the level of an intern, which makes sense because these people don't have extensive resumes of holding trusted positions and following the correct ethical procedures necessary to do that, right? So it's perfectly understandable why that is. It also looks like that many of them have been waived from various training requirements, like the cybersecurity requirement, right? Why might they do that? Well, you can't prosecute somebody for violating a cybersecurity rule that they were not given because the executives in NASA waived that requirement. So again, another place where Congress has actually afforded incredible independent power to federal agencies and departments to determine their own cybersecurity rules. The governing act for this is the Federal Information Security and Management Act, or FISMA. And FISMA says very little as to the standards and specific procedures necessary for someone to meet a cybersecurity competence level in government. That is mainly for the agencies to determine on their own. It is just that previously everyone was so afraid of messing up, and rightfully so, they would go a little bit overkill with these things, in my estimation. And now, under the new Trump regime, they have swung all the way back to the opposite side because of likely political and ideological reasons.
Two things to mention just on that is, one is, we want to emphasize this is sort of a special case of a kind of concerning thing we're seeing across federal agencies, which is levels of very privileged access to sensitive systems are being granted to people who clearly, just because of the time involved, cannot possibly have gone through the kind of, close scrutiny and vetting that would normally be required for someone to have that level of access. And this is, maybe especially concerning when you're talking about people who, have, alleged ties to cybercrime organizations, people who have been fired from previous jobs for allegedly leaking privileged information or proprietary information to competitors. Right? These are not necessarily people who you feel that comfortable bypassing the background checks and the vetting on. And also, of course, the elephant in the room here is Elon Musk owns a company, SpaceX, that does space launches, that has potential interest in contracts with NASA. So there's a kind of a conflict of interest question that comes up with a lot of Musk's involvement in all these different agencies of who's policing what kind of information is flowing to him, and who's policing whether decisions being made by DOGE staff, these agencies, about what gets cut and what doesn't, overlap with the business interests of Elon Musk.
Yeah, the idea circulated, who knows, a month ago, a year ago, in actual live time, that Elon Musk would enforce his own protections against his various conflicts of interest and recuse himself from those systems and those projects is, of course, absurd on its face. That is, it directly flies in the face of why we have conflict of interest rules and forms, right? Is because, of course, you cannot be trusted to recuse yourself, which is why anyone who is in this position, as I and many of my colleagues had to do repeatedly, was to put on file extensive forms, even for a very small fiscal impact, of what our financial interests were. So if it was shown that, in fact, I had not recused myself from something, there was some document on the record that a third party could say, hey, we got you, right? Yeah. And of course, whether it is at NASA, whether it's the Department of Transportation, whether it is at, the Federal Trade Commission, Elon Musk's interests are so wide, so vast, so varied, there is literally almost nothing he could do in government that isn't a conflict of interest, which is, of course, kind of the point. Speaking of Elon Musk, the not head of DOGE legally, but the real head, and if you were just listening to the audio version of this, I am heavily putting in air quotes right now, Amy Gleason, in a recent leak of a group chat to 300 people. I'm not sure it could be constituted as a leak if you're messaging 300 people. Claimed that she has no responsibility whatsoever for the mass firings that DOGE, her organization, has orchestrated across the federal government, especially most recently at HHS and its attendant subdepartments, of which approximately 10,000 people were removed. She made this comment directly after these layoffs occurred at HHS, that is to say the Health and Human Services Department. Quote, "Nothing about my role has been hidden. It was publicly announced shortly after I became acting administrator while I was on vacation in Mexico." That's my side. Gleason continued, "I will always fight for patients, for better healthcare, and for good people and employees, just as I always have. I still believe I can accomplish good things in my role." On one level, this is in line with one of our previous interviews where we received some comments from former USDSers or former or on leave USDSers in some cases, that they believed that Amy Gleason thinks that in this position, she is capable of doing harm mitigation. I do not think that is a plausible theory at this point. That's independent of whether Ms. Gleason still believes it personally, right? In terms of actual practice, there is no reasonable person who could look at the cuts at HHS and its subdepartments, things like the CDC, for example, and say that good people, employees, better healthcare, better prevention against pandemics, and patients were protected and assessed as part of these cuts, right? Mm-hmm. And so, at this point, the idea that Gleason, who is now also an employee at HHS, apparently, is independent, right? Is blameless for these cuts, simply belies belief in its entirety.
I mean, it may be true insofar as it's not clear how much she's actually running the show versus being a sort of figurehead, because they don't, for various reasons, formally to have Elon Musk be the head of the of DOGE.
Well, I think what I am having contention with is Ms. Gleason's own words. "I will always fight for X, Y, and Z."
Yeah.
Right? And so what is it, Ms. Gleason? Did you fight and lose, or is this statement a lie? It has to be one or the other, and such information was not included in your post, right?
I mean, I think also one of the, it seems like the, part of what the claim here is, if I'm understanding right, is, look, all these layoffs, these are decisions, legally this is true, formally this is true, right? These are layoffs being approved by the actual heads of the agencies, right? That, DOGE itself can't do this. It's the confirmed or acting head of the agency who is, actually signing off on the order. But we're also seeing over at I.R.S., hey, when the high-level staff at that agency don't agree with what DOGE wants to do, they end up having to resign or get fired. So, it's sort of clear who's actually in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and look, that's fine. That's, in fact, what I personally think, right? I was not in the room. I don't have a direct evidence of this, right? That's probably the true interpretation, right? But then to say after it has occurred that I'm fighting against these things, as opposed to past tense, I fought, I failed, or, hey, let's give some accommodation here. I fought and it could have been worse.
Sure.
That's a claim I'm willing to give some consideration to. I cannot read her actual statements as anything other than safe-facing. But you know what? The last line is maybe the most important one as to who will be the head of DOGE in 6 months when and if Elon Musk actually leaves his position. I still have no idea how much of the rumors that Elon Musk's tenure as the practical head of DOGE will come to an early termination or not, which is the last line, which I do believe, that Amy believes, that Ms. Gleason believes, "I still believe I can accomplish good things in my role." Well, you have a group chat of 300 people. I'm sure those will be the first people who will hear of the good things you will achieve in the future, Ms. Gleason. Let's jump now back to Julian.
Yep.
And not so much across the street, but quite a few stops away on the metro to the Social Security Administration.
Yeah, if you've been following these previous news roundups, we've talked on I think at least a couple of them about DOGE's access to Social Security and the changes they're trying to push through there. We have a story from NPR based on a new report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities about a plan starting, I think, as soon as next week to eliminate, for a lot of purposes, phone access or phone help. Not completely, but for a lot of things. So if you're trying to change the direct deposit destination for your benefits or apply for new benefits, and in particular, if you are trying to get survivors benefits from Social Security, those are things that are now going to have to be done either online or in person at a Social Security office. And as the report notes, there's a whole bunch of problems with this. The report notes more than 4 in 10 retirees apply for Social Security currently by phone, as do most spouses, as do the substantial majority of bereaved family members who are eligible for benefits after the death of a worker. A lot of seniors have difficulties either because of visual impairment or just not being very technically savvy with navigating online forms and online verification systems. And then if the alternative is to go in person, for about 6 million seniors, the closest Social Security office is around 45 miles away. So this is going to likely to be a barrier to people trying to access their legitimate benefits. In particular, in the case of survivors benefits, which apparently there won't be, at least at present, an online option for. They're going to have to find a place in person to go to for that. Apparently, Social Security itself, the Social Security Administration, has estimated that this will lead to 80,000 more people per week seeking in-person services, even as those offices are being shrunk and seeing reduced funding. So I think there's a very real likelihood of this, frankly, overwhelming those offices and their ability to provide help to people who are trying to receive Social Security. And remember, another story we did, I think, earlier this week was about how sort of post-DOGE, because they're trying to push out new code and new fraud checks, the Social Security website has been crashing repeatedly, been down for sometimes 20 minutes, but sometimes hours at a time. So combining that problem with reduction in the ability to access phone service, I think, is going to be a real problem for a bunch of people. And shifting gears completely to my old hobby horse of the intelligence community, apparently ODNI head, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, has been setting up her own kind of mini DOGE within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Not a DOGE, but a DIG, or Directors Initiatives Group, consisting of 10 people from outside the intelligence community who are supposed to cut costs and identify waste, but also ferret out intelligence weaponization. Now, the first half of that, I think, is probably actually overdue. There are existing bodies that could have been empowered to do this. But, I spent a dozen years as, again, a think tank geek working on the intelligence community. And I think one of the very real problems there is outside bodies, Congress and so on, get very limited information. The minority of members that are kind of cleared to access that information have to do it, in a skiff. Usually they can't take notes. They usually have very limited numbers of cleared staff who can know about that information. And, a pattern we've seen again and again is that the intelligence community tends to have a very kind of press release approach when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis of their systems. So if you remember the original warrantless wiretapping scandal back in 2005, and then later the Edward Snowden mass database of call records. In each of those cases, we heard very inflated claims about how all of the terrorist attacks that these programs had prevented. And then when an independent oversight body went in and actually did a deep dive and went over it with a wire brush, they said, no, that actually wasn't true. We can't really find any cases where these large and intrusive and presumably also fairly expensive programs actually prevented a terrorist attack. So I would say is probably overdue and a good idea. I don't know if I trust Tulsi Gabbard to do it, but in principle, it's not a bad idea. But also they're going to be looking at weaponization. And here I worry because this administration and before he was back in power, Donald Trump has been using the term weaponization to mean, essentially any government investigation that is aimed at me or my allies or embarrasses or inconveniences me. And there are absolutely, I should say, steps that were taken in some of the investigations of Trump in respect to the Russia's interference with the election that I think you could call it and say, no, they really made a misstep there. They did something inappropriate in some very specific cases. But weaponization has been deployed a lot more broadly to say, if Trump is charged with a crime, that's weaponization. If the intelligence community says Russia is helping Donald Trump and trying to interfere in the election, which was true, that's weaponization. So, my concern there is, well, what intelligence actions are they going to define as weaponization? If there are people looking at Russian election interference, is that going to fall within the ambit of their idea of weaponization? If there are investigations targeting people in Trump's inner circle, whether or not this might be legitimate, is that going to be defined as weaponization because it must be politically motivated? So I worry about whether this is going to sort of deter the intelligence community from doing things that are really part of their job, to the extent that it brushes up against people with connections to Donald Trump or, frankly, foreign activities that benefit Donald Trump.
I have nothing to say there. That's a slam dunk analysis from my point of view.
All right. Well, it's good to have you back, Noah, from your many travels. We will be back sometimes solo, sometimes in tandem, with more news updates soon. So stay tuned for those and for our next full-blown, long-form WatchCats podcast. This has been your news roundup for Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, and we'll catch you next time.